want to thank the gentleman for joining us. Our first witness is Mr. Andrew Bush, is the Global Currency and Public Policy Strategist for BMO Capital Markets Investment Banking Division. Mr. Alex Brill is Research Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. Mr. Chris Edwards is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and Dr. Josh Bibbins is an economist at the Economic Policy Institute. It's policy of the committee to swear witnesses in, so we'll do this again quickly. Gentlemen, if we can, do you solemnly swear, or if you'll raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record show that witness answered in the affirmative, and we'll start with Mr. Brill. We'll just move down the line again.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan and Congressman Kucinich and other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear before you this morning to speak on the stimulus bill. Its 2-year anniversary presents an appropriate time to evaluate the legislation's effectiveness. There are many metrics by which one could assess this massive Federal policy, but in my testimony today, I'll focus on just two: overall cost and, quote, shovel readiness. For better or worse, the ARRA was enacted because majorities in the House and Senate believed that a large fiscal stimulus could make a positive contribution to the economy by stimulating aggregate demand. Under that premise, and the assumption that the stimulus bill spending was not completely offset by a decline in private activity, the effectiveness of the legislation depends quite simply on the stimulus spending occurring in a timely fashion. My testimony this morning, I'd like to emphasize 3 points. First, we should recognize that the bill was rushed through Congress at a blazing speed. H.R. 1 was introduced on January 28, 2009, and signed into law on February 17th. A hodgepodge of policies ranging from high-speed rail to health information technology to home weatherization, hundreds of pages and thousands of projects. Second, the official cost estimate of the stimulus bill has varied over time, but always underestimates the true cost. The key to securing votes for final passage of the bill in the Senate was to reduce the final cost to $787 billion. Since that time, CBO has re-estimated the cost of the bill, once as high as $862 billion, and currently to be a cost of $821 billion. But all of these estimates fail to include the additional costs, already in excess of $60 billion, incurred when Congress extended certain portions of the bill. In fact, I would note that President Obama's fiscal year 2010 budget included items to make over 1/3 of the stimulus bill permanent. Third, and most importantly, the stimulus bill has done an extremely poor job at actually spending money in a timely way. Regardless of your view about the multiplier effect, the economic factor by which an injection of fiscal stimulus could, at least in theory, result in more activity down the line, the bill could not possibly be effective or cost-effective if the money is not spent in a timely fashion. While certain activities did occur quickly, such as additional checks to Social Security recipients or unemployment benefits and transfers to the states, none of these policies constitute the much-touted shovel-ready activity and the, quote, reinvestment that was the heart of this legislation. For example, the Department of Energy should never have been awarded a single dollar in stimulus funding. At the end of calendar year 2009, they had spent only 5% of their allocated funds. At the end of 2010, 2/3 of the Department of Energy's funds remained unspent, roughly $22.5 billion. Department of State, FCC, NEA, NSF, USAID, and the Corporation for National and Community Services have collectively spent only 37% of their funds as of last December. At the end of 2009, they had spent collectively only 8% of their funds. Even the Department of Transportation, which was supposed to be ground zero for shovel-ready projects, have, at the end of 2010, spent 56% and have nearly $20 billion left to spend, billions more from other departments. In my written testimony, I detail examples of programs that have, 2 years after enactment, spent only 2, 3, 4, 9, and 10% of their available funds. In conclusion, while labor markets in the U.S. economy remain weak and a robust recovery has yet to materialize, the worst of the recession is long over. If the stimulus bill was ever appropriate, and I think it was never appropriate, it was in 2009, not in 2011, and certainly not in 2012 and beyond. I urge the committee, given its jurisdictional responsibility, to continue to investigate carefully the causes that have resulted in this bill, which was intended to be timely, targeted, and temporary, to be implemented so slowly. Too much money was put into this bill in the first place. Too little of it was spent at the time the economy was the weakest. Clearly, government is not good at fiscal policy to turn the economy, and I hope the committee's work will help dissuade future Congresses from repeating these same mistakes. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brill. Mr. Bush.
Subcommittee Chairman Jordan and Ranking Member Kucinich, I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I was born in Ohio. I just was there recently and frequently speak. I was at the City of Guyana. They had an economics briefing there recently. So it's always great. It's always great to be in front of fellow Ohioans. I want to share my views regarding the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, specifically the results 2 years after the enactment on the economy and the financial markets. As you may know, I am the Bank of Montreal's global currency and public policy strategist, and I've worked in the financial markets since 1984. So my role is to analyze factors influencing the financial markets and provide guidance to our clients on the potential outcomes of policy. I've had the distinct pleasure of writing commentary on a daily basis since 1999 and wrote throughout the financial crisis of 2008. So reform and oversight of our nation's programs to create economic growth and financial stability are critically important, obviously. Bank of Montreal thanks you, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the committee for their upcoming work on these topics over the next 2 years. To reclaim its position of financial and economic leadership, the United States needs to understand the short-term and long-term impacts of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. So for the financial markets, ARRA Act was at best an economic disappointment, at worst a potential fiscal disaster. In the fall of 2008, the economy and the financial markets were in the midst of turmoil generating from the failure of Lehman Brothers, the Federal Government takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the collapse of the subprime loan markets. This created an environment of fear and uncertainty in the financial markets that led investors pulling out of their funds out of risky assets and placing them into the safe havens of U.S. Treasury securities. By the end of 2008, both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the yield on the U.S. 10-year note fell by nearly 50%. This extreme panic led to spreads between U.S. Treasury securities and other market securities such as high yield, investment-grade debt, and large bank debt to widen significantly and rapidly. As an example of the panic, the commercial paper market nearly froze completely when the primary reserve fund broke the $1 barrier. At this time, many large corporations lost the ability to fund themselves using this critical market. The entire financial system appeared to be at risk of seizing up and was in need of stabilization. The economy was deteriorating rapidly as businesses were unable to either receive credit from their bank or tap the debt markets for funding. One of the key questions before President-elect Obama and the incoming Congress was how to stimulate the economy in the most efficient and timely way. In late December of 2008, the financial markets reacted positively upon hearing the news that a large stimulus package was being discussed and debated in Washington, D.C. At that time, the news flow varied from a package between $500 billion to $700 billion, which included tax cuts and new spending programs. Contributing to the market optimism was the description of the package by then-Chair nominee-designate, Council of Economic Advisor Christine Romer, and Office of the Vice President-elect Jared Bernstein. This is the job impact of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Plan. So in their report of January 10, 2009, Romer and Bernstein laid out their findings and expectations for economic growth for a $775 billion program. It is critical to understand that the market's expectations for economic and employment growth from the plan were raised due to these findings. They estimated that the aggregate effect of the recovery package on Q4 2010 GDP would be to increase it from $11,770,000,000 to $2.2 trillion. They stated the effect of the package would increase GDP by 3.7% and increase jobs by nearly 3.7 million. They went on further to predict that the plan would make the unemployment rate 7% by Q4 2010 from the 8.8% that would result in the absence of the plan. The authors predicted a 678,000 increase in construction jobs using calculations and estimates of effects by industry by economist Mark Zandi. His report was the economic impact of a $600 billion fiscal stimulus package, Moody's.com, obviously, in November of 2008. Since the housing sector was a key variable in the financial crisis, the return of jobs to this sector was particularly optimistic and appealing to the markets. And at that time, there were many factors influencing the financial markets. However, this outlook was a contributing factor towards the rally in the U.S. stock markets that took the Dow up almost 13% in December. Subsequently, the markets became skeptical of the predicted outcomes by Romer and Bernstein as newspapers, bloggers, research began to break down the sections of the plan, the costs of the plan, and the potential increase in the fiscal deficits. The sovereign United States credit default swap price rose from 20 in October to 59.7, a stunning 300% increase. So the honeymoon for the stock markets was over, and they slid until March, when Federal Reserve Chairman appeared on 60 Minutes and stated that no major financial institution would fail.
Gentlemen,
So I'll just submit the rest to and move on.
I appreciate that testimony, Mr. Bush, and you can finish up when we get to questions. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for allowing me to testify today on the stimulus and federal spending. There has been a huge increase in federal spending over the last decade under President Clinton, from 18% to 25% today. Sorry about that. Part of that, of course, was the $800 billion stimulus, which sadly I believe was a very costly Keynesian policy failure. And note that the amount of Keynesian stimulus in the economy in recent years wasn't just the $800 billion. It was the total amount of deficit spending in recent years, $500 billion in 2008, and about $1.5 trillion for the 3 subsequent years. So that's about $5 trillion of so-called Keynesian stimulus, and yet we still got very high unemployment and a recovery that is more sluggish than in previous recoveries. Now, economists continue to debate, how much of a sort of a sugar high you can get from this sort of Keynesian stimulus in the short term. There is no doubt in the long term that this will damage the economy. Why? Because all that government spending reduces private spending. And there's 2 basic reasons, causes of damage caused by the spending. One, you're transferring resources from the more productive private economy to the less productive government sector of the economy. And there's all kinds of evidence for that. We've got a website at Cato, downsizinggovernment.org. We go through every department. We talk about the various failures of all the programs. But secondly, the transferring money from the private to the public is not costless. It causes what economists call deadweight losses. The extraction, the forcible extraction of the funds from the private sector through taxation causes these deadweight losses. So, for example, President Obama, let's say he wants to spend $10 billion more on high-speed rail. The cost to the economy is not $10 billion, it's $15 or $20 billion. I mean, Martin Feldstein says that there's every dollar the government spends causes $2 of private sector damage. The sad reality is the United States is not a small government country anymore. OECD data shows us total federal, state, local spending now at 42% of GDP. In my testimony, I show that ratio over the last couple decades. The United States used to be substantially lower than other OECD countries. The gap has been closing. And I fear that we're just going to become another sort of stagnant European welfare state if we keep all this spending going. Let me jump quickly to state and local spending, because a big stated cause for the stimulus package was to help state and local governments who were struggling with the recession. We've been bombarded with news stories in the last couple of years about how state budgets have been supposedly devastated and radically slashed. The reality is really different, and I've got Department of Commerce data in my testimony that shows total state and local spending has not been cut at all through the whole recession. It rose rapidly from 2000 to 2008. It was exactly flat 2009. Started rising again 2010. Total state local spending as a share of the economy was actually up over the last decade. So despite 2 recessions this last decade, state and local spending is actually higher than it's ever been. So there is a real state budget crisis, and that is ahead. As you know, the bond debt has been growing rapidly in the states. They've got huge pension and unfunded health care obligations. But here's the key point, I think, from a federal policymaker's perspective. The states are in radically different positions with regard to their budget gaps, with regard to their bond debt. Some states like Nebraska have virtually no borrowing, no bonds. Other states like Massachusetts have a huge amount of borrowing. Pension obligations, some states like Ohio, very high unfunded pension obligations. Other states, it's quite low. So the states are in radically different positions here. And I think this is one of the problems with sort of federal bailouts and federal aid, is that it's very unfair, and I think bad economics to punish the well-managed frugal states for the benefit of the poorly run and spendthrift states. So on the one hand, I'm not for federal bailouts, but as a last sort of point, you know, the federal government has continues to impose lots of costs on state governments, most recently with the health care plan, before that with the No Child Left Behind laws. All those regulations and costs are poured down onto state governments, which I think is bad economics and also unfair. And that's the end of my comments, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Dr. Bivens.
I'd like to thank the Chairman and the members of the committee for inviting me today. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the origins of what we now call the Great Recession and the rationale for the Recovery Act, and then just provide a little bit of overview of my assessment of it. Sometimes the origins of recessions are hard to see. Not so with what we call the Great Recession. Between 1997 and 2006, the real price of homes roughly doubled. They'd been roughly stable for almost 100 years before. Because the stock of housing in the U.S. is enormous, this added greatly to the wealth of American households, and housing wealth and the debt associated with it, as well as a huge activity in the home building sector, was the foundation for the 2000s business cycle. This was obviously unsustainable. Home prices fell by about 30% between 2006 and 2009. This erased about $7 to $8 trillion in wealth from American households' balance sheets, and consumer spending, just as predicted by a long range of economic theory and evidence, collapsed. Home building collapsed. Residential investment took about 3 percentage points off GDP as home builders realized they had built too much during the 2000s. These initial shocks to spending then cascaded throughout the economy. Businesses stopped investing because customers weren't coming in the door. Why would you build another factory when the factory you have is producing output that's not selling? And so essentially, the economy suffered a shock to aggregate demand. I mean, to deny this, to say that that was not the essential problem, I mean, you have to answer the question then, why did almost 9 million people lose their jobs in a 2-year period? American workers didn't wake up January 2008 with no skills. American factories didn't become obsolete in a month. American managers didn't forget how to organize production. We didn't suffer from an inability to supply goods and services. We suffered from an inability to demand them. And to be clear, I'm using demand in the economist way, desire backed by purchasing power. Purchasing power was gone. It was erased by the housing bubble. And so, by most measures, the shock to private sector spending caused by the bursting housing bubble was bigger than the one that led to the Great Depression. We didn't have a Great Depression mostly because we now have a central bank that leans much more aggressively against private sector spending shocks, and we allow budget deficits to rise to finance public spending to stem the gap caused by retreating private spending when you enter recessions. It was a big reason why we did not see the economy spiral into a depression. Arra was part of that pushing back against the shock to private sector spending, and in my judgment, it worked largely as advertised. We have a gross domestic product that's probably about $500 billion higher today than it would have been if we had not passed it. We probably have about 5 million full-time equivalent jobs that we would not have had Arra not passed. And this judgment is based on 3 considerations. I mean, first, virtually all private sector forecasting firms, people whose money depends on being more correct about short-term economic trends, say that Arra added a lot to output and employment. Second, these effects are in line with what research says you should expect from doing something like Arra in an economic environment like we've seen for the past couple years. Very high unemployment, very low interest rates, very low inflation. When one looks at research that says fiscal support cannot help the economy, it invariably is looking at the wrong episodes. Like the previous panel talked about looking at the 1970s and World War II, government spending didn't help. Well, it wasn't supposed to help in those episodes. You did not have very high unemployment along with very low inflation and very low interest rates in those episodes. When you look at episodes like what we've seen for the past 2 years, fiscal support works. Third, the timing was right. Basically, GDP contracted at about a 5% annual rate in the 9 months before the act was passed. It grew at roughly 2% in the 9 months, contracted at 5% before it was passed, grew by 2% in the 9 months after it. Same thing for employment growth. And then also, contrary to a lot of what has been written, it helped arrest the decline in consumer spending, and that's exactly what you would expect given that 2/3 of the act was tax cuts and transfer payments to individuals. Lastly, just a couple of words on the really easy debating point deployed against Arra, the sort of ritual trotting out of the Romer-Bernstein forecast. An earlier panel said, that people who say that the Romer-Bernstein forecast was wrong just because they underestimated how bad the economic shock was, said there's no evidence for that. You can't prove it. Of course you can prove it. You can look at what economic forecasters were saying at the time. And I actually had a figure. I'm not sure if we're able to blow it up or not. It's in my testimony. It shows the consensus blue chip forecast for what was going to happen in that sort of 6-month period in late 2008, early 2009. The blue chip consensus was GDP would contract by 1.5%. It actually contracted by closer to 5%. That gap between the blue chip forecast of what was going to happen and what actually happened equals about 2 percentage points of unemployment. In short, the difference in the forecast in Romer-Bernstein for what actually happened versus what they forecast to happen with Arra is because they followed the consensus forecast about the underlying health of the economy. It does not affect their estimate of how effective Arra was. We'd have about 3 to 4 million fewer jobs had we not passed Arra, and the fact that they underestimated the degree of the private sector spending shock that was hitting the economy in real time doesn't affect that. So essentially, I think the Recovery Act worked largely as advertised. I think the biggest problem with it, its boost to the economy is gone. I mean, by the first quarter of 2011, it's adding 0 to economic growth, and yet we still have 9% unemployment. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank the gentlemen excuse me, for their testimony. Let me start with Mr. Brill. I was intrigued by your comment that whether you embrace the multiplier effect doctrine or not, it seemed to me your testimony's conclusion was it really doesn't matter because the bureaucracy was so inefficient at actually allocating the dollars, moving the dollars out, that was a problem as well with this stimulus bill. Am I correct? Can you elaborate?
That is correct. Admittedly, some dollars did move quickly. Things where you simply needed to print a check or transfer funds, those payments did occur relatively quickly, and it's noted in my testimony. However, an enormous percentage of the dollars, and when we think about enacting legislation and the cost effectiveness of that bill, that legislation, an enormous amount of the money was delayed. It was delayed because, quite simply, the government, while it's good at spending money, turns out not to be very good at spending it very quickly. So there are numerous departments that have engaged in large, complex projects that require permitting, consideration, architectural designs and other things, and to get those dollars spent, it will take years. And some of that was understood at the beginning. That doesn't make it okay. Of course, CBO did note that this bill will have budgetary effects throughout the decade. But what we see at this point is how many programs have really yet to even begin.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and frankly, there's a continuation of them in the budget proposal that we got Monday from the President. I mean, I think of one example that jumps in my mind, this so-called high-speed rail, which I think is just not effective, not where we need to go. But there's a continuation of this in the current budget.
Absolutely. A number of policies. I'm less familiar with a specific review on the current policy, current budget, although high-speed rail is a perfect example. From the budget that came out in conjunction with the stimulus bill, over a third of those policies the President asked to make permanent. In other words, he was seeding in the bill long-term permanent spending policies.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Breaux. Mr. Edwards, I was intrigued by your testimony, too, when you got into the States and the different situations they face. I was wondering if you could elaborate, because when I look at what some States are doing versus the choices made by others, the most obvious example to me right now is New Jersey versus Illinois. New Jersey, where the Governor came in and said, we're not going to raise taxes, we're going to reduce spending, and we're going to try to create a climate which I would argue is conducive to economic growth, versus what they're doing in Illinois, which is raising taxes significantly. Can you elaborate on the kind of the choices being made there and those two models or those two decisions by governors and the legislatures in those States?
Right. I mean, we do have a federal system. The States, should be allowed to go in their own direction. Right. That's great, and that's one reason why I don't like the Federal intervention downwards, either spending or regulations, because I think it stifles good diversity in the States. We want the States to try different things with their education systems and investment in all kinds of stuff, so that hopefully, if New Jersey's moving ahead with public sector union reform, that's great. It can provide a good model for other states. So I like that diversity. But it is also true that the federal government imposes a lot of these costs, like with the health care law and the No Child Left Behind law, that I think are really really damaging.
Yeah. Mr. Bivens, I want to give you a chance to participate here as well. So if I understood your testimony, it's basically it would have been worse had we not done what was done in 2009. And obviously I disagree. I think much of the panel disagrees. And I would argue, just based on the stated goals of the authors of the policy, who again failed to be with us this morning, we didn't meet the goals they said. And I understand your comments near the end of your testimony. Well, they were using faulty data or data that wasn't up to speed at the time they made the decision. But the idea that we're going to spend $800 billion of taxpayer money, and the promise was to keep unemployment at a certain rate and it would be even lower today, I still am struck by I guess I still reach the same conclusion that I think, frankly, most Americans have reached, which is the only thing we got from the stimulus was 3 years of record deficits and the highest level of national debt we've ever experienced.
Well, I'd say what the real promise of the Romer-Bernstein report was, that we would have 3 to 4 million more jobs than the economy would have produced had we not done it. And that one, I think their judgment is right, and that's supported by, say, the CBO and other forecasters. And just one other point, too. I mean, just between December 2008, when they wrote that report, and March 2009, the month after Arra was passed, the economy lost 3 million jobs in those 3 months. I mean, that's essentially that 2 percentage point unemployment gap between what they predicted and what happened, right there. The fact that they did not realize that they were sitting on sort of an exploding private sector economy around them, I think it doesn't speak greatly of their economic forecasting ability, but nobody got that in real term. But that does not change the effectiveness of the policy or their evaluation of it.
Yeah, well, and that's my point. I mean, they were pretty darn specific in the number of jobs that would be well, excuse me, I'll say it this way, where employment would be. They were specific down to 137.6 million people employed. They were so at least you would be critical of the fact that they made these specific projections. At a minimum, you'd be critical of that.
That's right. I'd be more critical that they didn't that they took the blue chip consensus as a given and as a good forecast when it clearly wasn't. Okay. I don't think they were trying to break any new ground in forecasting. I think they were just trying to take off the shelf, these are reasonable things. People will not argue with this forecast, and the thing they grabbed that people would not argue with turned out to be very wrong because, frankly, most of the profession was caught very flat-footed by how bad the recession was.
Let me just,
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah,
quickly?
and if I give you one quick question, Mr. Bivens. Mr. Bivens, as an economist who supports the stimulus, if you were involved in putting this together, don't you think? I mean, wouldn't you want to come in front of a panel on Congress looking at your work product and defend it?
Sure. I mean, yes. Obviously, the stakes for me are a lot lower, so I don't know how it would have turned out if I had been an architect of it. But yes, I think there's ample reason to defend the stimulus package on its merits, and I think it should be done.
Okay. Mr. Edwards, then I'll move to Mr. Kucinich.
Mr. John Taylor had a very good paragraph in his written testimony where he basically said, the problem with a lot of these macro models is that they assume the results that, the results are assumed, they're programmed in. So if you have a Keynesian macro model and you have a big increase in government spending, the result is already baked in the cake that you're going to get GDP larger. And he says this is true with both the CBO model and Mark Zandi's model and other sorts of models. I agree with Russ Roberts that we should be very suspicious of all these macro models. Frankly, they are wrong time and time again.
Yeah. And the model to look at, frankly, is what happened. Right. I mean, that's the best evidence is what actually took place, is look at the facts. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
We'll go down to 5 minutes for the Ranking Member, Mr. Kucinich.
Just building on what Mr. Edwards said about the macro models, Mr. Chairman, the Romer-Bernstein report was released a month before the Recovery Act was signed into law. And what's interesting is that they had a qualification in this report. I want to quote it to you. Quote, "It should be understood that all of the estimates presented in this memo are subject to significant margins of error. The uncertainty is surely higher than normal now because the current recession is unusual both in its fundamental causes and its severity." So they qualified what they were saying. I think it's important that we that we know that, since, we're focusing on that report. I also want to say, in relationship to what Mr. Brill said about high-speed rail, I think it would be important for this committee to look into the relationship between between commerce and transportation's role in increasing the efficiency of commerce, or not. I think it's very important that we get into that, so we don't just reject out of hand certain approaches that could actually end up helping the economy. And I think high-speed rail is one of those discussions we ought to have. Now, Dr. Bivens, in your written testimony, I have to get this question to Dr. Bivens, but thank you. Dr. Bivens, in your written testimony, you state that private sector macroeconomic forecasters are in near universal agreement, unquote, about the positive impacts the ARRA has had on gross domestic product growth and unemployment. We know that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office agrees. We know that private economists like Mark Zandi agree. We know that organizations like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, as well as your organization, the EPI, agrees. Can you explain why so many forecasters agree about the positive results of the stimulus?
Yeah, like I said quickly in my testimony, I mean, it's in line with a long line of research that looks at the efficacy of fiscal support provided to economies that look like the U.S. economy today, characterized by very high unemployment, very low rates of inflation, very low interest rates. When you provide fiscal support in an environment like that, the research shows that it works very well. And I'll say one thing, this idea that the results are baked into all these models, that's actually not true. These multipliers are not taken from the air. These multipliers come out of the data. One, people look at the effect of fiscal support done in environments like we have today. They look at the historical record. They say, when you provided this fiscal support when unemployment was high and inflation and interest rates were low, what happened? And you use those multipliers estimated from real data. They are not plucked from the air.
Well, you've characterized the Recovery Act as small relative to the economic shock it was meant to absorb. If the stimulus was larger, do you think the unemployment rate would be lower than it actually is today?
Absolutely.
And what step does Congress need to take, in your opinion, to get more Americans back to work?
I think it needs to look at those parts of the Recovery Act that worked very well and continue or expand them. And so,
for example?
Unemployment insurance, the fact that that's been extended for another 13 months as part of the tax cut deal, that's a very good thing. It's going to support a lot of jobs. I would look at some of the other safety net programs. Food stamps are very good economic stimulus, let alone.
Explain why that is.
Essentially, the goal of economic stimulus is to get money spending quickly throughout the economy. And people who get food stamps and people who receive unemployment insurance are, by definition, people who are cash-strapped. They're not going to sock it away in savings. They need to spend it on, necessities in the here and now. And so the money circulates through the economy very quickly. I would also say I think the infrastructure spending, which has taken a bit longer to get online, but that's actually a good thing. I mean, we have 9% unemployment today. The idea that we have missed the boat on infrastructure spending, helping the economy if a project rolls out next month, we haven't missed the boat. We're going to have very high unemployment for a very long time. I mean, the CBO says we don't get back to pre-recession unemployment until 2016. So the idea that some of these projects are still coming online, I think, is a very good thing.
Well, and in line with that, I mean, where Mr. Brill talked about how, it takes a while for government spending to actually get into the system, would you say that if the government were to plan a massive rebuilding of America's infrastructure, beginning, let's say, this year, with the aim at putting Americans back to work, would you think that kind of an approach, which would parallel what happened during the New Deal with the WPA, that kind of an approach would benefit the economy, would stimulate the economy, would prime the pump of the economy and able to get people back to work?
Yes, I think it would be very good in the short term, and then I think it would add to productivity growth even in the long term and make us grow faster even when the recession is over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one of the things that we can do in our collaboration on this subcommittee is to bring people together to find out how we can create jobs and get America back to work. And I look forward to working with you in that. I thank the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Would now yield to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Brickell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here this morning. A couple of questions. sort of out of context. First of all, Mr. Brill, you talked about the slowness at which the money was spent, and I wondered if you had any ideas as to why it happened that way. And then beyond that, and this is to anyone on the panel, is there a way to know how much stimulus money remains unspent at this time?
Thank you. I think that there are a number of reasons that large amounts of the money remain unspent. Just as a point of reference, the CBO estimated last month that in the current fiscal year 2011, there will be $148 billion in stimulus funding, and over the remaining years of the budget window, there will be another $148 billion in fiscal stimulus spending. The reasons for the delays, I think, are numerous. Depends likely agency by agency or department by department. Many of these programs are large, complex building projects where simply to get the project designed and approved, put online, permitting requirements that were necessary, environmental assessments that were necessary in order for certain construction projects to begin, takes a lot of time. There are some projects that are in the midst of being completed, in essence, bridges half built, and there are certainly billions of dollars of other projects that have not yet even begun.
And so your estimate for the amount right now that's unspent of the stimulus money?
Beyond the current fiscal year is $148 billion, and to be spent in this current year, an additional $148 billion. So some of that 148 is we're midway into the fiscal year. So I'd ballpark it at about $200 billion in unspent dollars.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment regarding any estimate unspent stimulus monies? Dr. Bivens, my question to you, we've heard several times throughout the course of the morning that perhaps the stimulus, the amount of the stimulus wasn't enough, and that was the reason why we did not see the robust economic recovery that we had hoped for. And my question to you is, if the intention was to keep unemployment, say, at 6 or 7%, what would that amount, what should the amount of the stimulus been? What could we have spent to achieve that rate of unemployment?
To achieve that rate of unemployment, it may have been impossible to ever keep unemployment going above 7%, given the quickness and the severity of the shock from the housing bubble. That said, I think the economy could have easily absorbed a stimulus package almost twice as big, say $1.5 trillion, without running into the remotest risk of, say, overheating the economy or providing too much support or doing anything like sparking higher inflation or high interest rates, which is supposed to be the downsides of doing too much fiscal support. We could have had a stimulus package twice as big and not even flirted with any of those troubles.
Can I make a comment on that? I mean, one of the problems I see with this sort of the Keynesian stimulus approach is that economists like Mark Zandi and others, they say, oh, I supported this big stimulus and it's got the government much deeper into debt, which is going to create this giant burden in the future on young people. At the same time, people like Mr. Zandi are saying, oh, we need a plan to reduce spending and get these deficits under control. We need a credible plan to reduce these deficits. If you're a Keynesian economist, you can never have a credible plan to reduce deficits because we might have a recession again in 2013 or 2014. And what would Mr. Zandi want? He would want another $1 trillion stimulus. You can go on this endless cycle of stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. And I think it's a complete dead end. I think there's a giant moral judgment being made that for some reason Congress thought that goosing people's income and consumption now during this recession was a lot more valuable than the damage and harm that is going to be done by young people with this heavy burden of taxes and deadweight losses and interest payments that they're going to have to bear. So a short-term goose for long-term pain, I don't think that Congress should be in the business of making that sort of value judgment.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. We'll yield to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador. I'll recognize him.
Mr. Bush, We keep hearing about there's this consensus among the forecasters. Do you agree with Dr. Bivens that there's a consensus among the forecasters that the stimulus had a net positive effect? And in your opinion, were financial markets aided by the stimulus?
Right. I think there's a consensus among Keynesian economists that it had an impact. One of the things I wanted to point out, and I'm sorry I screwed up my testimony, but one of the things I would like to see, if we're to believe Romer's model and the way that they formulated it, why don't we extend it further and look at her research that she did on taxes? Because if you look at the stimulus bill and you say, well, we spend $800 billion, that's great, it does this and this and this, but you don't tell the whole story, because that money has to come from someplace. And if we use Romer's research, right, and we say, let's say the United States borrows 40 cents on every dollar. So that means of $800 billion, you're looking at borrowing of $280 billion. And if it's a negative 3-to-1, you're back to $600 billion, and you're only going to use $200 billion of the $800 billion as any kind of stimulus. And I would love to see that in bills put forward into Congress. Anytime you're looking at spending, have the effect of how much you're going to borrow to pay for this and what the downside effect in taxes are going to be. Because I think that would really focus and clarify for a lot of the members the impacts. So I would disagree. I mean, again, with the Keynesians, that's what they argue. They only fail because we didn't spend enough. The financial markets looked at it this way, that way more than what Congress did, there were beneficial effects from what the Federal Reserve did on a short-term basis. But both what Congress has done and what the Federal Reserve have done come with costs. Congress obviously has to find a way to pay for what they did. The Federal Reserve will find a cost in inflation very soon, if not already, by what they're doing.
Mr. Brill, do you have any comments about that?
I would just add the fact that that the argument put forth in the but-for case is a tricky one, and it's actually a tricky one on both sides. I think that we shouldn't have too high expectations for economists to be good fortune tellers, especially at turning points in the economy. But the lesson from that, I think, is that Congress needs to be wary. And so we live in a world where there are business cycles, and there will be a recovery, and there will be a future recession. And when we come to the next point where economists are concerned about the economy, and it seems that we're in recession, and there will be calls again for fiscal stimulus. Well, we should keep in mind that it's difficult to predict what the future course of the economy is going to be. And therefore, it's difficult for Congress to craft policies, both to envision the right policy as well as for the executive branch to execute on those policies. And that, as was discussed in the previous panel, stable fiscal policy, policies that have low tax rates, low marginal tax rates, and stable low spending rates, not policies that have huge ballooning deficits like the ones we face, are the ones that are likely to minimize the business cycle risks that we face.
Dr. Bivens, is there a moment where we're spending too much? Because, I mean, you're saying, I was really surprised to hear that unemployment insurance and food stamp actually creates jobs. I mean, that to me was pretty incredible to hear. Is there a moment that we spend too much money on these things? Or because I think if we're spending $100 billion, if we create so many jobs, why not spend $1 trillion? Why not spend $5 trillion? If spending government money is creating jobs, then let's spend it all.
Well, that's pretty easy. I mean, you reach the limit when you run the risk of overheating the economy by sparking inflation or high interest rates. I mean, that is the textbook case for macroeconomics. You provide fiscal support until you run the risk of overheating the economy in that way. And we're in no danger of doing that. Core rates of inflation are at 60-year lows. Interest rates are at 60-year lows. I mean, we're just running into none of the danger signs of having done anything like too much. And so $5 trillion, yes, I think that'd be too much. I think in terms of the current political debate, we are in absolutely zero danger of doing too much and overheating the economy through too much fiscal support.
Could I just make one quick comment
Sure.
on that? Greece felt the same way at some point.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the issue, is at some point the financial markets aren't going to allow the United States to borrow indefinitely at the rates that they are. So if you try to expand, and again, expand budget deficits, at some point they're going to turn on you. And again, the United States is borrowing at exceptionally low interest rates, and that could change, as we've seen since November, when interest rates have gone up 100 basis points.
Well, and if you you question the Federal Reserve Chairman, he would indicate that they can pull back at the appropriate time. I think that's a big if. But that's the argument you hear, and I would assume Dr. Bivens would say that, but again, I think that's scary when you're looking at a handful of people who think they can outguess and outperform and guess and have the right timing and beat the market and figure out ahead of them. I just think that's a scary place to go. And so I did want one last thing, if I could. Mr. Brill, you gave a $200 and some billion figure. The facts that we're getting, or the numbers we're getting on stimulus dollars that have not been spent, are much less than that. I mean, we're hearing 92% of stimulus dollars are out the door. So is that number, I assume some of those monies are already obligated dollars but haven't been out the door, but they're already in contract, or what? Tell me where you're getting that number, if you would, real quickly.
Yeah, sure, exactly. The difference being the allocated funds versus dollars spent.
Okay.
So the government has successfully decided what to do with most of the money 2 years after enactment.
But hasn't written the check.
But hasn't actually written the check.
Okay, great. I want to thank the witnesses for your insight and appreciate you spending some time with us. We're adjourned.